Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little less philosophical, but no less fascinating. The food served in Wild West saloons. Sure, they were known for whiskey, bar fights, and questionable piano music, but what did people actually eat there? Was it all beans and bacon? Or were there surprises hiding behind those swinging doors? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hit you when you walked into a Wild West saloon wasn't the piano music or the sound of someone losing a week's wages at cards. It was the smell. Forget the romanticized scent of sizzling steak and fresh cornbread. The real bouquet was more like a punch in the nostrils, a complex blend of sweaty cowboys, wet tobacco, old beer, damp wood, horses that hadn't bathed in a decade, and, if you were lucky, the faintest hint of something cooking in the back. Some saloons tried to mask it with sawdust on the floor, or pipe smoke thick enough to cause temporary memory loss. Others just embraced it. "You don't come here for the air," barkeeps would say, slapping flies off the counter with a rag that hadn't been cleaned since the Civil War. And yet, somehow, there was always a kitchen. It might have been a hole-in-the-wall fire pit with a pan of beans bubbling over embers. It might have been a grumpy woman in a soot-covered apron stirring mystery stew with a spoon that doubled as a self-defense weapon. But food was being made, somewhere, and if you could smell it through the sweat and the whiskey vapour, you were halfway to dinner. That is, if you could find a seat. Most saloons weren't laid out like modern restaurants. There were no servers, no menus with scripted fonts, just a few splintered tables, some rickety chairs, and one long counter where you could eat, drink, argue, or all three in rapid succession. If you were a regular, the cook might shout something like, "Beans or stew?" and you shouted back your choice without looking up. If you were new in town, they'd stare you down, trying to guess whether you were going to pay or pass out before the plate hit the table. And that's what made saloon dining so special. It wasn't about taste. It was about survival. You ate what they had, not what you wanted. You sat next to strangers who might rob you or save your life tomorrow. And if the food made you sick, well, that's what whiskey was for. In the hierarchy of Wild West cuisine, beans sat squarely at the top, not because they were delicious, but because they were cheap, indestructible, and could survive an apocalypse, a gunfight, and a stampede without breaking a sweat. Pinto beans, black beans, navy beans, it didn't matter. If it was dry, vaguely edible, and could be boiled into submission, it ended up in the pot. Beans were the unsung heroes of saloon kitchens, served morning, noon, and night, often to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since they left Kansas. Preparation was simple. Step 1. Pour beans into a pot. Step 2. Boil them for 6 hours over a questionable fire. Step 3. Serve them with salt pork, a stale biscuit, and a look of mild apology. Some cooks tried to get fancy, adding lard, onions, or even chili powder if they were feeling ambitious. But most didn't bother. In the Wild West, flavour was considered a luxury, and seasoning was whatever blew in from the open window. Beans were hearty, filling, and predictable, 3 traits that cowboys respected more than gold. They fueled long cattle drives, powered poker nights, and gave you something to chew on while you waited for the piano player to start again, or for someone to get tossed through the front window. The only downside? Aftermath. 1 cowboy eating beans was tolerable. 10 cowboys in a saloon full of beans was a biological weapon. It's said that some bar fights weren't started by insults, but by a single silent but deadly betrayal near the stove. Still, beans were dependable. When the meat ran out, when the chickens fled, and when the cook had exactly 7 brain cells left from the whiskey fumes, the beans remained, unbothered, unburnt, unchanged. Some cowboys even preferred them. They could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and used as makeshift currency in emergencies. Legend has it a man once bought a horse with 3 pounds of salted beans and a promise never to return. So yes, saloon food had its highs and lows, but beans were the baseline, the bedrock, the humble heartbeat of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love them, you respected them, and sometimes that was enough. If beans were the soul of Wild West saloon cuisine, salt pork was its slightly greasier backbone, a slab of fat and meat so tough it could survive a thunderstorm, a bar brawl, and 6 months in a saddlebag without changing texture. Salt pork wasn't bacon, though cowboys loved to pretend it was. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, preserved in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt kept it from rotting, and also, arguably, from being edible. Cooked right, salt pork was tolerable. Fried up in a hot skillet, served crispy and sizzling, it had flavour, grease, and that satisfying crunch that made you briefly forget the rest of your dinner came from a can. But cooked wrong, which happened often, it was like chewing a salted boot heel dipped in axle grease. Still, salt pork had its fans. It was easy to transport, hard to ruin, though many tried, and gave even the blandest pot of beans a salty punch of joy, or at least a reason to drink more whiskey. Cooks in saloons didn't waste a single bit. The fat used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits. The rinds, tossed into stews or given to dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who didn't know the difference. One bite, and they'd learn real quick that the barkeep wasn't joking when he said, "Chew slow or choke proud." And yes, sometimes the pork was suspicious. A greenish tinge here, a questionable smell there. But in saloons, the motto wasn't, "Is it fresh?" It was more like, "Did it kill the last guy?" If not, you gave it a try. Salt pork was versatile too. It could be diced into beans, slapped on biscuits, fried alone, or gnawed at like jerky on long rides. Cowboys packed it like treasure, and saloon cooks leaned on it when the chickens ran off or the stew pot got too thin. It wasn't elegant, and it sure wasn't healthy. But in a world where you might ride 60 miles before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done. And if you survived it, well, you were stronger for it. In the Wild West, stew was the great culinary equalizer, hot, vaguely meaty, and deeply suspicious. It was the one thing almost every saloon served, no matter how ramshackle the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect cover story for whatever odds and ends the cook had lying around, or couldn't legally describe. The base was simple, a pot, a fire, and ambition. You started with water, maybe some beans or potatoes, and then you tossed in whatever hadn't walked away yet. Beef? Sure. Rabbit? Definitely. Squirrel? Yep. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't biting anymore, toss it in. One traveller once claimed he found a boot string in his bowl. He wasn't even mad. It was the most chewable part. Meat quality varied wildly. Some stews had tender chunks of beef from the local butcher. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the cook looked nervous and the dog population had recently decreased, you just ate around the chewy bits and prayed. Vegetables, when available, were usually boiled into oblivion. Carrots became orange smudges. Onions disappeared completely. Potatoes held on the longest, but eventually surrendered. The result? A bubbling brown-grey slurry that smelled way better than it looked and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming enough salt. Spices were a luxury. Most stew got its kick from whatever was on the cook's hands or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a fancy place. If you got chili powder, congratulations. Your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. But despite the mystery, stew was comfort food for the weary cowboy. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched endlessly by just adding water. One pot might feed a dozen men, or be reheated 3 days in a row until it developed the consistency and personality of old glue. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible, unless you liked chewing tobacco and regret. Just remember, never ask what's in it. Because in the Wild West, ignorance wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Not every cowboy could afford a steak, but nearly every saloon had something bread-like to soak up the stew. That something usually came in one of two forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were heavenly when fresh, or hardtack, which was basically bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the biscuits. When done right, which was rare but magical, they were warm, buttery, and flaky enough to convince a man he'd stumbled into a proper kitchen. Cooks who could make good biscuits were local legends. Some claimed their secret was lard, others swore by buttermilk. A few probably just had lucky hands and low standards. These biscuits were best served alongside beans or stew, used to mop up whatever broth hadn't burned your tongue. They were often made in cast iron pans, baked over open flames, and served with a suspicious chunk of butter or a splash of molasses if the place was fancy. And then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water, baked until it could survive nuclear winter. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, it found its way west thanks to one simple fact: it never went bad. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required strategy. First, you'd inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal breaker, just an added crunch. Then, you'd soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it softened. This could take anywhere from 10 minutes to 2 presidential terms. Even after soaking, chewing hardtack was a commitment. You didn't just eat it, you grappled with it. Dentists probably made good money off cowboys who challenged a piece and lost. But here's the thing. Both biscuits and hardtack served their purpose. They were cheap. They were portable. They filled you up. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, that was enough. So if you strolled into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. If they handed you a hardtack puck the size of your palm, well, at least it came with a story, and maybe a chipped tooth. If you think modern coffee is strong, try cowboy coffee. A brew so potent it didn't just wake you up, it stared back and dared you to blink. Coffee in the Wild West was less about taste and more about survival. It wasn't roasted by origin, filtered through fancy gadgets, or topped with oat milk foam art. It was ground roughly, or not at all, dumped into a kettle, and boiled until the liquid turned black and sentient. The standard recipe went like this. Take water from whatever source you had, hopefully not downstream from the horses. Throw in a handful of coffee grounds, measured by instinct and aggression. Boil it, hard. Don't strain it, don't question it. Just pour and pray. The result? A thick, dark concoction that smelled like burnt dreams and tasted like vengeance. It wasn't uncommon for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, which meant cowboys got both caffeine and fibre in one heroic gulp. And yet, they loved it. Coffee kept you warm on cold desert mornings. It kept you awake through night watches. It masked hangovers and helped digest questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and punishment, all in one tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a kitchen, but if they did, it came out boiling hot, probably old, and strong enough to strip paint. One cowboy described it as like drinking a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone. Fancy folk might have added sugar or canned milk if available. Everyone else just grimaced and powered through. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, you'd get the boldest brew known to man, thick as tar and twice as resentful. It's worth noting that some cooks reused old grounds to stretch the pot. This economy method led to coffee that tasted like disappointment and regret, but it still counted. Because in the Wild West, you didn't drink coffee for pleasure. You drank it to feel alive, and stay that way. In the Wild West, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, status, and occasionally a test of bravery. If you could afford it, you might walk into a saloon and order a steak. What you got depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against your face. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. In reality, it was often a tough, overcooked slab of beef that had been fried in a pan with lard, scorched into obedience, and served with exactly zero garnish. If you asked for it medium rare, the cook would just stare at you until your mustache wilted. When fresh beef wasn't available, and let's be honest, it usually wasn't, saloons turned to other options: dried jerky, salted buffalo, occasionally venison, or even wild boar, if someone had gotten lucky on a hunt. And by lucky, we mean managed to hit it and drag it back before the buzzards did. In mining towns or far-flung settlements, meat got more creative: squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast jackrabbit with seasoning. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was fair game. Sometimes you were served meat, and no one told you what it was. That was a sign to eat quietly and not ask questions. If you chewed too long or found something resembling a whisker, you just sipped your whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. There was also the risk of age. Some meats had been hanging around long enough to earn names. Cooks would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy, and tell you it was well-aged. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were entitled to one raised eyebrow and nothing more. Still, when the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't drunk, you might get a real meal. A sizzling slab of beef, a fried egg on top, and maybe a biscuit on the side. A plate that reminded you why people survived gunfights, for this. But most of the time, you ate what was there, and hoped it didn't eat you back. In a Wild West saloon, dessert wasn't really a category. It was more of a happy accident, the result of a cook with spare ingredients and a tiny sliver of mercy. But if there was one reliable sweetish comfort, it was cornbread. Made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and sometimes a dash of baking powder, if the cook remembered. Cornbread was the Swiss Army knife of the frontier menu. It could be baked in pans, fried in skillets, or even dropped by spoonfuls into boiling stew if someone was in a hurry, or lazy. Alone, cornbread was dry, crumbly, slightly sweet, depending on who made it, and always best served fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. More often, you'd get a wedge that had been sitting near the stove since sunrise, hardened like a miner's conscience. But here's where the magic happened. Molasses. A dark, sticky, syrupy miracle that turned dry cornbread into something just shy of glorious. It was the cowboy's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, the lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything on a bad hand. Molasses was affordable, kept well in the heat, and masked the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were in luck. If they warmed it before serving, you were practically eating at a 5-star establishment by frontier standards. Some cooks went a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and tossing in a pinch of salt or spice. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week. Cornbread with molasses became the default dessert. Quick, cheap, filling, and sweet enough to calm your nerves after a rough ride or a close call in the poker room. No icing, no whipped cream, no frills, just grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction. And for many, it was more than enough. Because when your life involved cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, dessert didn't need to sparkle. It just needed to remind you that not everything in the West was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to stumble into a saloon before noon, preferably sober and not bleeding, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. And if so, you were in the presence of a miracle. Or a trap. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs in the Wild West were gold. Not actual gold, but nearly as rare and equally fragile. Chickens weren't raised for fun. They were cranky, prone to wandering, and occasionally stolen, eaten, or lost to foxes. If a saloon had eggs on hand, they either had their own chickens, a local supplier, or a secret smuggling operation from the next town over. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else. You learned not to ask. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood and the egg's age. Some were scrambled to disguise colour, others were fried until the yolks turned to leather. And if it wobbled when it hit your plate, that was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. As for chicken, it was on the menu, but not often. If it said fried chicken, what you'd probably get was a scrawny bird that died angry. Tough, bony, and fried in lard until the flavour tapped out, chicken wasn't always worth the chewing. But it was meat, it was hot, and it wasn't beans again, so folks ate it gratefully. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, or a whole quarter roasted on an open flame. You might also get a feather in your gravy, and that was just part of the charm. Breakfast offerings of eggs and chicken were a status symbol for saloons. They said, "We have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel." If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you'd tell your buddies for weeks. And if it gave you food poisoning, well, that was just the West reminding you who was in charge. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning, they meant survival, and just maybe, they meant you'd live to drink again by nightfall. In a Wild West saloon, pie was more than just dessert. It was a statement. If you saw a pie sitting on the bar, steam rising, crust golden, scent of apples wafting through the smoke and whiskey, you knew this saloon meant business. You also knew that someone in the kitchen had put in real effort, which was practically a love letter in a land of bean slop and overcooked pork. Now, don't get ahead of yourself. Pie in the Wild West wasn't a perfect lattice-topped pastry with farm-fresh fruit. It was a rough, rustic affair, uneven crusts, fillings made from canned or dried fruit, and usually served lukewarm at best. Whipped cream, not unless a cow followed you into town. The most common varieties were apple, peach, or berry. Berry being a flexible category that sometimes included raisins or things that only vaguely resembled berries. If the cook had a sweet tooth, you might get a dash of cinnamon. If not, you got crust, sugar, and optimism. Still, pie was a rare treat. Most cowboys hadn't seen one since they left home, and saloons knew that offering pie gave them a competitive edge. A good slice could pull customers from 2 towns over, and if the pie was warm and flaky, you better believe someone would threaten to shoot over the last piece. There are recorded stories, and a few exaggerated legends, of poker games that ended in gunfire over dessert disputes. You took the last slice was as valid an offence as cheating at cards. In a world where men had been stabbed over spilled whiskey, pie was practically sacred. Of course, not all pies were created equal. Some were mostly crust, some were experimental. Some had fillings that hinted at being fruit once in a previous life. But if the stars aligned, the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit wasn't fermenting, then that pie was something to remember. Because in the dust and grit of the frontier, a slice of pie wasn't just food, it was hope served on a tin plate. Cheese in the Wild West was a lot like a poker game, full of risk, a little bluffing, and a strong chance you'd regret your choices the next morning. It did exist, yes, but only if you knew where to look, and even then, you had to be brave. Because cheese wasn't shipped in tidy wheels wrapped in wax paper. It was made locally, often by someone who once read about dairy fermentation while drunk. Most saloon cheese came in 2 varieties, hard, yellow, and suspiciously sweaty, or soft, crumbly, and slightly aggressive to the nose. Refrigeration, that was a luxury. So unless it was a particularly cold month or the saloon was near a cave, chances are your cheese had developed a personality. It might be cheddar. It might be something vaguely Swiss. It might be a lump of dairy guesswork with salt on top. And if it squeaked when you bit into it, well, that was between you and your jaw. Cheese was usually served in chunks alongside bread, jerky, or if you were lucky, a pickle. It helped balance out the saltiness of everything else, and gave cowboys a protein boost between brawls. You could even melt it over beans or toast it on cornbread, assuming the cook was feeling artistic. But beware, some saloons cut corners. Cheese might be old butter gone wrong, or curdled milk pressed into a bar shape and rolled in pepper to distract you. One travelling merchant once said he bought cheese in Nevada that tasted like boiled sock with a rind. He still ate the whole thing, because even bad cheese was still cheese. And in the Wild West, a saloon that offered any cheese at all stood out. It meant the owner had connections to a local farm, or at least access to a cow that hadn't been rustled yet. Offering cheese wasn't about flavour, it was a flex, a symbol of civilization in a place where most people still bathed with sand. So if a saloon plate came with a slice of cheese, you'd eye it, sniff it, tap it with your fork, and then eat it anyway. Because in the West, a gamble was just part of dinner. If it could be soaked in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, chances are it was served in a Wild West saloon. Pickling wasn't just a flavour choice, it was a survival strategy. Before refrigeration, saloon kitchens relied on brine and sourness to keep food from crawling off the shelf. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, even meat. Nothing was safe from the preserving power of vinegar. And that's how we got pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers? The classic. Crunchy, sharp, and occasionally green. They were served as sides, chasers for whiskey, or just something to chew on between bad decisions. If you were lucky, they were made fresh with garlic and spice. If not, they tasted like regret and rainwater. Pickled eggs? A saloon staple. You'd see them floating in cloudy jars behind the bar, usually near the whiskey. They looked like ghostly eyeballs and had the texture of sadness. Some cowboys swore by them. A quick shot of protein, easy to store, and they mostly stayed down. Others swore at them. Pickled onions? Common in mining towns, sharp, tangy, and strong enough to chase off unwanted conversation. One bite, and you could talk downwind of a stampede. Even pickled peaches or pears might make an appearance. When dried fruit was soaked in sweet brine to create a dish both confusing and strangely addictive. It wasn't dessert, it wasn't dinner, it was just wet, vinegary optimism. The beauty of pickled goods was their shelf life. A saloon could keep jars around for months, sometimes years, without worrying about spoilage. And in a place where meat went bad faster than a poker hand, that was invaluable. But let's be honest, not all pickled items were created equal. Sometimes the jars weren't sealed right. Sometimes the cook experimented. And sometimes the pickled thing stared back at you. There are tales, possibly exaggerated, of men biting into pickled sausages only to find bones, or a label that simply read, maybe pork. Still, pickled foods were part of the Wild West experience. Salty, sour, and strangely satisfying, like everything else that lasted out there. You didn't eat them for pleasure. You ate them because they wouldn't kill you. Probably. When food was scarce, the kitchen was closed, or the stew looked like it still had a pulse. Cowboys and drifters alike turned to the most dependable item on the saloon menu: whiskey. It was always available. It required no preparation. And if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry, or that you'd just eaten a bowl of squirrel mystery meat. Whiskey in the Wild West wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by connoisseurs. It was rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever the barkeep had lying around, it was distilled in back rooms, barns, and bathtubs. The result was a beverage that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel a fistfight. Some called it rot gut, others chain lightning, and a few simply referred to it as lunch. When beans were burnt and bread was mouldy, men drank their calories, one burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a survival tool. It helped numb the pain of trail dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and highly questionable stew. One shot before a duel, 2 shots after, and maybe 3 more while you waited to see if your bullet wound was serious. It was common for saloons to serve whiskey specials, which came with a side of beans or a biscuit, not for flavour, but to keep you upright. Some men ordered whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which somehow counted as both hydration and protein. And of course, whiskey was social glue. You bought it to make friends, to start fights, and occasionally to apologise after both. You could measure a saloon's reputation by how fast its whiskey knocked a man off his stool. Quality? Don't ask. Some whiskey was barely more than coloured moonshine. Additives ranged from tobacco juice to cayenne pepper. It burned going down, and if it didn't, you were probably drinking kerosene. Still, no one complained, because whiskey was warm, cheap and honest, the only thing on the menu that never lied about what it was. And on nights when your meal came in a glass, with no fork and no judgment, you raised it high and called it dinner. In any Wild West saloon that dared serve food, there existed a shadowy, smoke-covered figure whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and the town preacher combined: the cook. This individual, often unshaven, always irritable, was either a life-saving genius or a culinary war criminal. There was no middle ground. You'd never see them smile, but you'd remember their cooking for days, either in gratitude or gastrointestinal trauma. Saloon cooks weren't trained chefs. They were usually ex-miners, ex-cons, or ex-somethings who knew how to build a fire and weren't afraid of questionable meat. Their kitchen, a fire pit